Brian Thorne adjusted his tie knot for the third time, while Melissa, his 24-year-old girlfriend, refreshed her Instagram feed. Again. "Melissa, put the phone away," he said, trying to sound patient. "We're celebrating the company merger." Okay, she replied without looking up. "But we're going to Miami now that you closed this deal, right? My friends are going to die of jealousy." Brian exhaled slowly. 6 months. He had been divorced from Emma for only 6 months, and already he was living what he'd called his success life, the kind of life where your girlfriend cared more about envy than your actual company. Emma. The name still stung. She had been everything. The college girlfriend who patched his shirts, stayed up late proofreading his proposals, believed in him when even his own family didn't. But when the money started coming in, Emma stayed. Emma. Simple. Homey. Content with movie nights on the couch and dinner at home. She didn't impress investors. She didn't network. She wore comfortable sneakers to important events. And Brian, in his newfound arrogance, decided that meant she didn't match his future. He was convinced he needed someone who fit the brand, someone who looked good in pictures, someone like Melissa. So he did it. He served Emma the divorce papers and a generous check, and said the words that still echoed in his chest at night. "You don't fit my vision anymore." Emma didn't scream. She didn't break anything. She simply looked at him with a deep, quiet sadness and said, "One day you'll learn the price of this, Brian. One day you'll learn." Then she walked out into the rain with one suitcase. "Hello? Earth to Brian?" Melissa snapped her fingers in his face. "The waiter's been standing there forever. Order already." Before Brian could answer, the entire restaurant went silent, not gradually, instantly. The kind of silence that happens when a real celebrity walks in, when the room collectively forgets how to breathe. Brian turned in his chair. The maître d'-pierre, a man who normally treated everyone with aristocratic indifference, was practically bowing. 2 discreet bodyguards flanked the couple entering. The man was tall, silver-haired, wearing a tailor-made suit that probably cost more than Brian's car. Brian recognized him immediately. Adrian Vance, owner of Vance Enterprises, the logistics empire dominating 3 continents. The kind of power that made Brian look like a lemonade stand owner playing CEO. But Adrian wasn't what made Brian's heart stop. It was the woman on his arm. She wore an emerald green dress that flowed like water. Her hair, once always shoved into a messy bun, fell in perfect waves. A necklace of gemstones caught the light like tiny stars. And then Brian saw it. The unmistakable curve of her belly. Pregnant. Very pregnant. "My God," Brian whispered. "What?" Melissa asked, turning. "Oh, that dress is gorgeous. You're buying me one like that, right?" Brian couldn't breathe. Emma, his ex-wife, pregnant, about 7 months. Judging by the belly. 6 months since the papers. But then Brian's mind did what it does when it's desperate. It rewound. 6 months since the signatures, but they had been emotionally separated long before that. Still, seeing her like this was a punch straight through his ribs. His wineglass slipped from his hand and spilled across the white tablecloth, red blooming like a wound. "Brian!" Melissa shrieked, jumping back. "You stained my bag!" But Brian wasn't listening. Emma and Adrian were being guided through the room toward the best table in the restaurant, the one Brian, with all his new money, could never reserve. They would have to pass by his table. Brian expected Emma to look down, to shrink, to show embarrassment. Instead, when her eyes met his, she looked straight at him. No fear, no anger, no love, just polite indifference, like he was a stranger. Adrian placed a protective hand at the small of her back and whispered something into her ear. Emma laughed, light, genuine, effortless, a sound Brian hadn't heard from her in years. Then they walked past, simply walked past, as if Brian Thorne didn't exist. "Wait," Melissa narrowed her eyes. "Isn't that your ex? The boring one you said was pathetic?" Brian stared at the red stain on the tablecloth. "Yeah," he said hoarsely. "That's Emma." Across the room, Emma and Adrian took their seats at the best table in the entire place. And for the first time since the divorce, Brian Thorne felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: fear. Brian pushed his untouched plate away. His stomach was twisted into knots. Across from him, Melissa loudly tore into her lobster while complaining the sauce tasted weird. Brian couldn't stop staring at the corner table. Adrian was cutting Emma's steak into small pieces, an intimate, protective gesture. Emma laughed at something he said, her hand resting on her rounded belly. "You're ignoring me," Melissa pouted. "It's because of her, isn't it? You're still in love with your ex." "Don't be ridiculous," Brian snapped, harsher than he meant to. But it wasn't love. It was worse. It was the bruised ego of someone who once saw a person as property. That should have been my family, he thought. That baby should have been mine. "I'm going to the restroom," he lied, standing abruptly. "Again? Babe, you drink way too much water." Brian ignored her and walked straight toward Emma's table. Two massive bodyguards appeared out of nowhere, blocking his path. "Move," Brian said, pulling out his CEO voice. "I'm an acquaintance." "Mr. Vance isn't receiving visitors," one of them replied, bored. "Let him through, Marcus." Adrian's deep voice came from the table. The bodyguards stepped aside. Brian walked into their space, heart pounding. Emma didn't even lift her eyes from the menu. "Emma," Brian said, tension cutting his voice thin. Slowly she lowered the menu. Her eyes met his, calm, distant, unreadable. "Hi, Brian." Her tone was polite. "I was wondering how long it would take you." "You're pregnant," he blurted. "Sharp as ever," she replied dryly. Brian glanced at Adrian, who watched him with an amused smile, sipping his whiskey, then back to Emma's belly. "Is it mine?" Emma let out a short laugh, like she couldn't believe he'd asked. "Yours, Brian?" she said. "You gave up the right to ask that the night you threw me out at 11 p.m. because I didn't have vision." "If that's my child, I have rights," Brian hissed, stepping closer. "I have lawyers who can—" "Sit down, son," Adrian said. He didn't shout. He didn't stand. He simply spoke, and the authority in his voice stopped Brian mid-step. "Mr. Thorne," Adrian continued, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "You seem confused. Let me clarify. First, don't raise your voice at my fiancé. It makes the baby nervous." "Fiancé," the word hit Brian like a punch to the throat. "Second," Adrian's eyes hardened, "about paternity, you were so busy chasing your—" "What is she again? An Instagram model?" He smiled without humor. "You were so busy, you barely touched your wife in the last year of your marriage. We both know the timeline. Don't embarrass yourself pretending you were present." Brian's face burned. He looked at Emma, searching for cracks in her armor. "Emma, tell him who I am." "I did tell him who you are," Emma said softly, one hand on her belly. "I told him you were the man who made me feel small so you could feel big. I told him you said I had no value." She reached for Adrian's hand. "And then Adrian showed me I don't have a price." "You're with him for money," Brian spit, desperate. "That's it. You traded a millionaire for a billionaire. You're just another gold digger, Emma." The air around the table turned ice cold. Adrian set his glass down. The sound was soft, but it landed like a gunshot. "Careful," Adrian murmured. "You're speaking to the director of the Vance Foundation." He leaned in slightly. "And unlike you, Brian, she didn't inherit or steal her worth. She rebuilt herself from the ruins you left." At that moment, Melissa tottered over in heels, impatient and offended. "Babe, what is taking so long?" she whined, grabbing Brian's arm. She looked at Emma and made a face. "Oh, it's you," she smirked. "Wow, you got big. Divorce didn't treat you well." The silence that followed was surgical. Emma didn't get angry. She smiled, slowly, pityingly. "And you must be Melissa," Emma said. "Brian always did have a taste for things that sparkle and mean nothing." Melissa choked. "Excuse me?" "Keep him," Emma said, returning to her menu. "I already threw him away." Then she tilted her head, almost kindly. "But here's a tip, sweetheart. Read the prenup. Brian's very protective of his pocket change." Adrian laughed, low, dark. "Marcus," he said to the bodyguard, "please remove them. They're ruining my appetite." The security guard stepped forward. "This isn't over, Emma," Brian growled as he was guided away. "You can't hide my child from me. I'll destroy you in court." Adrian rose. He stepped close enough that only Brian could hear. "If you try to sue her, if you harass her, if you even look in her direction again," Adrian's voice dropped into a quiet threat, "I won't sue you, Brian. I'll buy your company, strip it down piece by piece, and leave you with nothing but that cheap tie around your neck." Brian swallowed hard. He had no choice. He returned to his table, Melissa still whining about how rude they were. But Brian couldn't hear her, because when he signaled for the check, desperate to escape, he saw a man in a grey suit approach Adrian's table. A court officer. Brian paused. "Is Adrian getting served?" "No." The officer walked right past Adrian and stopped at Brian's table. "Brian Thorne?" the man asked. "Yes, you've been served." He placed a thick envelope on the table, right beside the wine stain. Brian tore it open with shaking hands. It wasn't a lawsuit from Adrian. It was from Emma. Plaintiff, Emma Vance Cross. Subject, intellectual property theft. The Thorne algorithmic model. Brian's blood turned to ice. The algorithm. The code that made his first million. The code he claimed he wrote. The code Emma had written in their college dorm 10 years ago. She hadn't come back for revenge. She'd come back for everything. Morning arrived without mercy. Brian hadn't slept. He spent the entire night in his office, staring at the lawsuit, drinking cheap whiskey, trying to understand how his life had collapsed so fast. At 8 a.m., Marcus Sterling, his lead attorney, walked in with the expression of a man about to deliver a death sentence. "Tell me this is a joke, Sterling," Brian muttered, shoving the paperwork across his desk. "She was an arts major. She corrected my emails. She didn't write any damn code." Sterling adjusted his glasses. Sweat gathered on his forehead. "Brian, our forensic IT team analyzed the source code for the Thorne algorithmic model, the foundation of your entire platform." Brian's jaw clenched. "And they found something buried in the kernel." Sterling tapped his laptop, projecting a screen onto the wall. It was complex code, but inside the syntax were hidden comments. "So you can finally sleep tonight. Love, E." Brian stared. A memory hit him like a slap. 7 years ago. He was failing. His code crashed every time he ran it. He passed out from exhaustion on the couch. When he woke up, the program worked. Emma sat there with coffee, smiling tiredly. "I tweaked it," she'd said. He thought she'd fixed a typo. He didn't realize she'd rewritten the entire architecture. "It gets worse," Sterling said quietly. "The suit claims she registered copyright for this specific architecture under a pseudonym, Ghost Writer, 3 days before you launched the platform." Brian shot up so fast his chair toppled. "She owns the IP," Sterling continued, "and she's requesting an emergency injunction to shut down your servers until a settlement is reached." "Shut down?" Brian felt panic crawl up his spine. "If the servers go down for an hour, our stock drops 10%. If we're offline indefinitely. Thorne Tech collapses within a week," Sterling finished. "You need to settle. Give her money, give her shares, apologize, anything." He swallowed. "Because if this goes to court, she has the digital proof." And then Sterling added the final blade. "And she has Adrian Vance's legal team." Brian walked to the window, looking out at the city he believed he owned. His phone buzzed. A message from Melissa. "Babe, my card got declined at Gucci. Fix this now, everyone is staring." Brian hurled the phone at the wall. It shattered. "Where is she?" Brian asked, voice low. Sterling hesitated. "She's hosting the Silver Gala tonight at the Metropolitan Museum. Charity event for single mothers. Tickets are $20,000. Get me a ticket." "Brian, if you approach her, you violate—" "I said get me a ticket," Brian snapped. "I'm not harassing her. I'm reminding her she loved me." He inhaled like he could pull control back into his lungs. "Emma is emotional, sensitive. If I can talk to her alone, away from Vance, I can convince her to drop this." Sterling didn't look convinced, but he made the call anyway. The Metropolitan Museum had been transformed into a silver and white dream. The elite drifted through the halls with champagne flutes and whispered gossip. Brian arrived alone. No Melissa. He needed to look serious, regretful. He wore his most conservative suit, but still felt like an imposter in his own skin. Every whisper felt like it was about him. Did you hear about Thorntech's stock? Vance Global is circling a competitor. Brian pushed through the crowd, scanning for emerald green. He didn't see green. He saw silver. Emma stood on a raised platform near the Temple of Dender, holding a microphone. She wore a shimmering silver maternity gown, like liquid moonlight. She looked like royalty. And that's why the Vance Foundation is pledging $50 million, Emma said clearly, for legal support and protection for women who are unfairly stripped of everything in divorce. Applause exploded. Brian felt nauseous. It was a direct hit. When Emma stepped down, surrounded by donors, Brian made his move. He slipped through the crowd and called her name right as security tried to guide her away. "Emma!" The people around them parted instinctively, hungry for drama. Emma turned slowly. Adrian wasn't beside her. He was across the hall speaking with a senator. "This is my chance," Brian thought. "Brian," Emma said, expression unreadable, "you bought a ticket. How generous." Then she smiled, sharp, controlled. "I assume the 20,000 is your first installment toward the support you still owe me." A few people chuckled. Brian leaned in, voice desperate. "Emma, please, we need to talk privately." "I have nothing to say to you that can't be said in front of a judge," she replied. "It's about the company," Brian pleaded. "You're going to destroy everything. Do you know how many people will lose their jobs?" He swallowed. "You're not like this. You're kind. You're the woman who used to rescue stray cats." Emma's eyes flashed. "The woman who rescued stray cats died the night she slept in her car," she said calmly, "because her husband cancelled her credit cards." The crowd audibly gasped. Brian went pale. "I didn't know you had nowhere to go," he stammered. "I thought you'd go to your parents." "My parents are dead, Brian," Emma said. "You knew that, you just didn't care." She stepped closer, voice dropping, quiet but lethal. "And about your company? It isn't yours. It was built on my code, my sleepless nights, my talent." She held his gaze. "You were the face, Brian. I was the engine. And now I'm taking the mask off." Brian tried to grab her hand. "Emma, wait. And the baby? If you destroy me, you destroy his inheritance." "That child, he's mine, isn't he?" Emma looked at his hand on her arm, then back at him. She didn't pull away. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You want to know about the baby, Brian?" Brian nodded, breathless. "Yes, I have a right to know." "Okay," she said, loud enough for the circle around them to hear. "The night you threw me out, I was holding a small white box. Remember?" Brian blinked. Yes, she had been holding something. He'd knocked it from her hands in the rush. "I remember. Inside that box was a positive pregnancy test," Emma said, her voice trembling with contained anger, "and a tiny pair of baby shoes." The room went silent. "I tried to tell you. I tried to say, Brian, we're going to have a family." She leaned in, and you looked at me and said, "Take your trash and get out." Brian felt the blood drain from his face. "So don't stand here pretending you care about fatherhood," Emma said, her words sharp. "You abandoned your child before he was even born." She inhaled. "And now he has a father, a real man, one who held me while I cried, who went to every ultrasound, who built the nursery with his own hands." "That's not the same," Brian whispered, barely human. "Biology matters." Emma's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Biology makes you a donor, Brian." She paused, eyes steady. "Love makes you a father." A heavy hand landed on Brian's shoulder. Adrian Vance. He had crossed the hall so quickly it felt like he appeared. "Is there a problem here?" Adrian asked, calm and terrifyingly controlled. "We were just talking," Brian said, trying to shrug off Adrian's grip. He couldn't. It was iron. "It looked like you were bothering my wife," Adrian said. "She's not your wife," Brian hissed. Adrian smiled, reached into his pocket, and slipped a folded document into Brian's jacket pocket. "Read that when you leave," Adrian said softly. It's a copy of a legal filing confirming you have no parental claim. Brian's mouth went dry. You can't do that. Adrian's smile didn't move. I'm Adrian Vance, he said simply. I can do what I need to do. Then he leaned closer. Now get out of my way before I have security remove you in front of everyone. Humiliated, crushed, with the eyes of New York burning into his back, Brian turned and fled into the cold night outside Central Park. He pulled the paper from his pocket. It wasn't just a filing. It was a DNA result attached to the back. Subject, Brian Thorne. Result, 0% probability of paternity. Brian froze. He read it again. 0%. His fingers trembled as he scanned the fine print. Then he saw the doctor's note at the bottom. Note, subject has a congenital condition causing sterility, likely present since adolescence. Brian let the paper fall onto the sidewalk. He wasn't the father. He never had been. He couldn't be. The truth hit like a train. All those years blaming Emma, making her feel broken. Pushing treatments, hormones, injections, and the whole time, the broken one was him. Brian sank onto the freezing pavement. He had destroyed everything. And now, there was nothing left. Brian woke up on his office couch with his mouth tasting like ash and his skull splitting. The cheap whiskey bottle beside him was empty. Sterile. I was always sterile. The cruelty of it made him want to laugh. He spent years making Emma feel inadequate, hinting the problem was her, while the truth sat inside his own body like a secret defect. His phone rang. Melissa, he answered out of habit. Brian, she screamed. My card got declined again, this time at Sephora. Are you humiliating me on purpose? Brian hung up. He didn't have energy for her. Not with the company crumbling, his identity collapsing, and Melissa screaming about makeup. Sterling stormed in without knocking. Turn on the TV, he said. Now. Brian stumbled to the monitor and turned it on. A live press conference. Adrian Vance stood at a podium. Emma was beside him, calm, composed, fierce. This morning, Adrian said, voice carrying through the speakers, a desperate man attempted to intimidate a pregnant woman using the media. He looked directly into the camera. Brian Thorne accused my fiancée of infidelity. He accused me of destroying a happy marriage. Adrian paused, almost amused. We anticipated it. Because liars always assume everyone lies. Emma stepped forward and took the microphone. I did not cheat on Brian Thorne, she said clearly. I was faithful for 7 years. She held up a document. I supported him when we had nothing. I wrote the code that made him rich while he slept. Brian's stomach dropped. Then Emma said the thing that made the room spin. This is a medical report from Mayo Clinic from 8 months ago, 1 month before Brian divorced me. Her voice shook slightly. It confirms I completed 1 IVF cycle using a donor. Brian froze. IVF? I did it, Emma continued, because my husband was desperate for an heir, but refused to see a doctor. She swallowed hard. I wanted to surprise him. I wanted to give him the family he said he wanted. I paid for it with my own savings. I did the injections alone. The silence on the broadcast was heavy. I found out it worked the day Brian served me divorce papers, Emma said, a single tear slipping out. I tried to tell him. He didn't listen. He threw me out. I was pregnant, homeless, alone. And that's when Adrian Vance found me. Emma looked straight into the camera. He didn't steal me from you, Brian. You threw me away. He just picked up the treasure you were too blind to see. Adrian returned to the microphone, face cold. And regarding business, Mr. Thorne seems to have forgotten something about the ghostwriter architecture he stole. Brian felt the blood drain from his hands. Emma didn't just write the code, Adrian said smoothly. She protected it. There is a security mechanism embedded in the kernel, an emergency switch. It activates if an unauthorized user attempts to tamper with the core files. He checked his watch. And according to our logs, Mr. Thorne's team attempted that this morning. Adrian leaned forward, voice deadly calm. The switch activates in 3, 2, 1. In Brian's office, the lights flickered. The hum of the server room died. Brian's monitor went black. A terrified assistant burst in. "Sir," she cried, "the platform is down, the app is down, everything is offline, the code is... it's deleting itself." Brian slammed the keyboard. Nothing. Only a black screen with blinking green text. "Error, unauthorized user. Goodbye, Brian." On TV, Adrian's voice cut through like ice. "Thorn Tech is now effectively a shell company without assets. The stock is in free fall, and we have already contacted the SEC with evidence of fund diversion, corporate funds used to bankroll the lifestyle of Mr. Thorn's mistress." Adrian's eyes were flat. "Checkmate, Brian." The broadcast ended. Brian sat in the dead silence of his office as his phone started ringing. Board members, regulators, banks. He didn't answer. Sterling looked at him, pale. "Brian, it's over. The company is done." Brian laughed. Low, broken. "I know." 3 weeks later, Brian Thorne signed the final bankruptcy documents in a grey law office that smelled like dust and despair. Sterling had jumped ship 2 weeks earlier, collecting his unpaid fees through the courts. Now Brian had a public attorney who looked like he'd graduated yesterday. "Basically," the young man said, pushing up his glasses, "you lost everything. The penthouse, the cars, the accounts. The SEC froze assets during the investigation." "I didn't steal anything," Brian muttered. "You spent $340,000 in 6 months from the company account," the attorney said flatly. "Hermes bags, Tiffany jewelry, a trip to Ibiza, all filed as business representation expenses for Melissa Chen, who wasn't an employee or partner." Brian shut his eyes. Melissa. He went back to the penthouse after the cards were permanently shut off. It was empty. She had taken everything that wasn't bolted down, even the bathroom towels. On the kitchen island, she left a note. "You're a loser, Brian. I don't do broke men. Good luck being nobody. M." No thank you, no goodbye, just nothing. "What do I have left?" Brian asked, voice hollow. The public attorney cleared his throat. "A paid-off apartment in Queens, in your late mother's name. You inherited it, so it's protected. And you have about $8,400 in an old checking account the SEC missed because it's been inactive for years." Brian laughed, bitter. $8,000. He used to spend that on a weekend. "Oh, also this," the attorney added, sliding a manila envelope toward him. "Delivered this morning, from the Vance Foundation legal office." Brian's stomach flipped. He opened it with shaking fingers. He expected another legal notice, another knife. Instead, it was a handwritten letter, Emma's handwriting. "Brian, I'm not writing to you out of pity. I'm not writing to forgive you. I'm writing because you need to understand something. I don't hate you. Hate requires you to still matter. And the truth is, Brian, you don't matter anymore. I withdrew the lawsuit, not because you deserve it, but because carrying you would cost me more energy than you're worth. You already destroyed yourself better than I ever could. The code has been restored. It's being donated to an educational foundation that will teach programming to low-income women. Your name has been removed from all documentation. You spent 7 years telling me I had no value. Now you know what it's like to be invisible. Do not contact me. If you try, the protective orders return. Live with your choices, Brian. I'm already living with mine. E. Brian read the letter 3 times. Then he set it down, hands trembling. She let him go. Not with a slap, not with revenge, with indifference. And somehow, that hurt more than anything. Chicago's wind cut straight through Brian's thin jacket as he stomped his feet on the frozen sidewalk outside the Grand Plaza Hotel. 3 years. 3 years since his empire collapsed. 3 years since he'd last seen Emma. Now he was Jules, the name he used because Brian Thorne raised too many questions. "Yo, Jules!" Manny, his 22-year-old supervisor who vaped through every shift, yelled, "Big event tonight, Tech Future Gala, VIPs everywhere. Don't scratch anything, old man. These cars cost more than your life." Brian flinched, not from the cold, but from the irony. Tech Future Gala. 5 years ago, he'd been the keynote speaker. He remembered the lights, the applause, Emma sitting in the front row wearing a simple blue dress, looking at him like he was something worth believing in. Tonight, He was the help. The hotel doors opened, spilling warm golden light and jazz onto the snowy sidewalk. The air smelled like expensive perfume and gourmet food. Brian's stomach growled. He'd skipped lunch to save $5. Guests began arriving. Brian recognized faces. Marcus Sterling, his old lawyer, laughing with a new client. Sterling handed over the valet ticket and looked straight through Brian as if he didn't exist. Brian brought the Mercedes around and accepted a $2 tip in silence. It was a special kind of hell, being invisible in a world where you used to be worshipped. "Heads up!" Manny hissed. "Big fish coming. Armored Escalade. That's Vance Security." Vance. The name hit Brian like electricity. He wanted to run, hide in the locker room, disappear into the concrete, but his feet stayed frozen, trapped between terror and a sick kind of curiosity. The massive black SUV rolled up, flanked by 2 security vehicles. "Manny, open the door," Manny snapped. "Jules, go." Brian stepped forward. His hands shook so badly he clasped them behind his back for a second. He saw his reflection in the tinted window, thin, hollow-cheeked, haunted eyes. He looked 20 years older than 38. He pulled the heavy handle. Warmth poured out. Leather, cedar, jasmine. First a shoe stepped out, an Italian Oxford, hand-stitched, polished. Adrian Vance emerged. Time had been kind to him. If anything, it had increased his presence. Salt and pepper hair, sharp military cut, the calm grace of a man who owned the ground beneath him. He didn't look at the valet. He turned back, extending his hand into the SUV. "Careful, love, it's slippery." A hand took his. A hand Brian knew better than his own. Emma stepped out. Brian's lungs forgot how to work. She was breathtaking. A deep red velvet gown flowed to the ground, wrapped in a soft white coat like fresh snow. Her hair fell in glamorous waves, diamonds at her throat, elegant, timeless. Not loud, but it wasn't the outfit. It was her face. The stress lines she carried during their marriage were gone. In their place was a serenity that made her glow. She looked rested. She looked loved. "Wait for me," a little voice called from inside the SUV. Brian froze. A small boy, maybe 4, climbed forward, bundled in a navy coat and red scarf. Dark curls, bright eyes, a child who looked at the world like it was something safe. Adrian laughed, deep and warm. "We didn't forget you, Leo. Come here, champ." Adrian lifted him effortlessly onto his hip. The boy giggled, wrapping his arms around Adrian's neck. "Did you see the robot, Daddy?" Leo asked excitedly. "The one with lasers?" "I did," Adrian smiled. "But I think you liked the dessert table more." "I like cookies," Leo declared solemnly. Emma laughed, brushing a snowflake off the child's nose. "You're definitely your father's son, obsessed with sweets and fascinated by lasers. Your father's son." The words echoed in Brian's head. Leo wasn't his. The DNA test had buried that fantasy forever. He was sterile, a genetic dead end. All that obsession with legacy, dynasty, the Thorn name. A lie. Real legacy was right in front of him. A happy child, raised by a man who never needed to demand respect. Brian stood there, paralyzed. He should close the door, step back, disappear. But he couldn't stop staring at the boy. Leo had Emma's nose, Emma's smile. Then the boy looked at Brian. Leo didn't see a fallen king. He didn't see a fraud. He just saw a man in a funny hat standing in snow. "Hi," Leo said, waving his tiny gloved hand. Something inside Brian cracked. Tears burned hot behind his eyes. He tried to speak, but his throat locked shut. Emma turned, following her son's gaze. Her eyes landed on the valet. For one heartbeat, nothing moved. Snow fell in quiet spirals around them. Then recognition came. Not dramatic, no gasp, no clutching pearls. Just a small widening of her eyes as she absorbed the cheap uniform, wet shoes, older face, the name tag, Jules. Brian braced himself. He expected mockery, a laugh, a whispered comment to Adrian. Look at him. He almost wanted her anger. Anger would mean he still mattered. But Emma didn't get angry. Her expression softened. Her shoulders lowered slightly. She looked at him with a deep, crushing pity. The kind of look you give a stray dog that's been kicked too many times to trust anyone. Pity. Pure, quiet pity. She didn't say his name. She didn't acknowledge their past. She simply turned back to her husband and child. "It's freezing, Adrian," Emma said softly. "Let's get Leo inside. He's shaking." "Of course," Adrian replied. Adrian turned to Brian. He didn't recognize him. To Adrian Vance, Brian Thorne was a footnote in the first chapter of his life with Emma. So insignificant he didn't even register as familiar. "Good service," Adrian said, firm but polite. He reached into his coat and pressed a bill into Brian's hand. "Stay warm," Adrian said. Brian looked down. A crisp $100 bill. Benjamin Franklin stared back like a joke. "Thank you, sir," Brian whispered. His voice sounded broken, unrecognizable even to himself. Adrian nodded and guided his family toward the private entrance. "Bye-bye!" Leo called over Adrian's shoulder, waving again. Brian lifted a trembling hand and gave a tiny wave back. "Bye," he mouthed. He watched them disappear inside, watched Adrian lean down and whisper something to Emma, watched Emma rest her head on Adrian's shoulder. They moved like a single unit, a solid circle of warmth and love. They were a family, and Brian was just the man who opened the door. The heavy glass doors closed behind them, cutting off the view. The street's silence rushed back in. Wind howled around the corner. Brian stared at the $100 bill in his hand. In his old life, he would have used that to light a cigar, tipped it to a waitress for bringing water, laughed at how small it was. Now, that piece of paper meant food, heat, survival. He clenched it so hard his knuckles turned white. A sob rose in his chest, ragged, painful. He leaned against the cold stone wall and slid down until he was crouched on the wet sidewalk. He'd built a fortress out of money to keep people away, thinking it made him powerful. He treated human beings like assets and liabilities. He threw away the one woman who loved him for free, because he wanted a reflection that looked better in a magazine. He wanted to be a king. And now he finally understood. Kings are fantasy. Real power isn't in a crown. It's in the hand you hold when the snow starts falling. Emma found a hand to hold. Brian had nothing but his hands in his pockets. "Yo, Jules!" Manny shouted from the booth, unaware of the wreckage. "Stop counting tips. Corolla incoming. Move!" Brian wiped his face with the rough sleeve of his jacket, inhaled. The cold air burned his lungs, dragging him back. "Coming!" he rasped. He stood, smoothed his oversized uniform jacket, slipped the $100 bill into his pocket beside his bus pass, and walked toward the beat-up Corolla at the curb. He opened the door, forced a smile, and bowed his head. "Welcome to the Grand Plaza," he murmured. "How can I help?" 6 months after the hotel encounter, Brian woke up on a Saturday morning to the sound of children playing outside his Queens apartment. He lay on the narrow twin bed, staring at the cracked ceiling he now knew by heart. Sunlight slipped through a dirty window. Dust danced in it. He was 39. He looked 60. Valet work paid the bills. Barely. He ate too much instant noodles, took the bus, wore the same 3 shirts on rotation. But he was alive, and somewhere in the world, Emma was living a life he no longer belonged to. Brian picked up his old phone, a cheap model he'd bought second-hand. No Instagram, no social media. But on impulse, he opened the browser and typed her name. Emma Vance search results filled the screen. Emma Vance launches new scholarship program for women in coding. Vance Foundation donates $100 to tech education. Emma Vance named one of the 50 most influential women in tech. He clicked an image. Emma on a stage, microphone in hand, smiling brightly. Beside her stood Leo, now 4, wearing a tiny suit that was painfully adorable. Adrian stood in the wings, watching her the way Brian once watched his own reflection, except Adrian's gaze wasn't narcissism. It was love. Brian closed the browser. He didn't feel rage. He didn't feel envy. He felt nothing. And for the first time, he understood what Emma meant when she wrote, "You don't matter anymore." He finally did. Later that day, Brian walked to a small park near his apartment and sat on a worn bench. He watched families, parents pushing kids on swings, mothers laughing, couples holding hands. A man around 50 sat beside him, grey beard, kind eyes. "Nice day," the man said. "Yeah," Brian replied. "You look like you're carrying a lot," the man observed. Brian gave a short, bitter laugh. "You have no idea." "Try me." Brian stared at him. Why not? He had no one, no friends, no family. "I had everything," Brian began quietly. "Money, success, a woman who loved me. And I threw it away because I thought I deserved more. I thought she wasn't good enough for me." The man nodded, listening. "And now, she's living the life I thought should be mine. And I'm here, alone, broke, invisible." The man tilted his head. "You think her life should be yours?" Brian paused. "I used to, but now, no. She built that life. She deserves it. And you?" the man asked. "What do you deserve?" Brian looked at his calloused hands, hands that once signed million-dollar deals, hands that now opened car doors for tips. "I deserve exactly where I am," Brian said, and for the first time, he meant it. The man patted his shoulder. "That's the beginning of wisdom, son. Understanding choices have weight." He stood. "You're still young. You can build something. Not what you were, but something real." "I don't know if I can," Brian admitted. "Nobody knows until they try," the man said, then turned to leave. "Good luck, Brian Thorne." Brian froze. "How do you know my name?" The man smiled. "I know a lot. I was a CEO once, too. I lost everything to greed. It took me 15 years, but I rebuilt. Different, smaller, humble, better." He looked back once. "You can too, if you want." Then he walked away. That night, Brian returned to his apartment, cooked instant noodles, and ate on the edge of his bed in silence. Then he grabbed a cheap notebook he'd bought at a dollar store, opened it to a blank page, and started to write. Not a business plan, not a manifesto, a letter of apology. Not to Emma, she had made her boundary clear, but to himself, for his choices, for the people he hurt, for the man he became. He wrote until his hand cramped, until tears blurred the ink. Then he folded the page, slid it into an envelope, and wrote on the front, "To the man I was, from the man I'm trying to be." He sealed it and put it in a drawer. And for the first time in years, Brian Thorne slept without ghosts. 10 years later, Brian, now 49, stood in a small community classroom in Queens, teaching basic coding to low-income teens. He wasn't rich. He lived in a one-bedroom apartment, drove a used car, but he was free. One day after class, a 16-year-old student named Maria lingered. "Mr. Brian," she said, hesitant, "I Googled you. You were, like, famous?" Brian smiled softly. "I was known," he admitted. "But famous? No." He paused. "Fame and respect aren't the same thing." Maria studied him. "And now, do you have respect?" Brian looked out the window at the city's endless motion. "I'm working on it," he said honestly. "Every day." Maria smiled and left. Brian packed his materials and glanced at the framed photo on his desk, not of himself, but of his last graduating class. Bright faces, hopeful eyes, people with potential. He hadn't built an empire, but he built something that mattered. And finally, after all those years, Brian Thorne understood the difference between having everything and having enough. Some endings don't come with apologies. They come with silence and consequences. This wasn't a story about revenge. It was a story about replacement, of love with ego, of loyalty with appearance, of depth with image. Emma didn't destroy Brian's life. She simply kept living hers. And Brian learned something too late. Sometimes the punishment isn't what happens to you. It's what never happens again. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Stories We Tell. We tell stories where choices echo, pride has a price, and silence says more than words ever could. Thank you for watching.